All right. Good morning, Rocky. Ismaail, thank you so much for joining.
All right. Hey, everybody. Well, welcome back to another Fridays with Rocky here, and joined with the great guest and Ismaail Qaiyim, who's like Greg said, is a friend to the show. Obviously, we he's not a stranger to the Fridays with Rocky platform. And again, as always, very grateful to the Charlotte Mecklenburg Public Library for providing this platform to get valuable information and valuable discussion out to the community. And so, obviously, today's discussion, as you kind of see on the screen, is tenant defense and housing rights. And as we were kind of talking about, earlier before we started started our discussion here today, is what is the state of Charlotte Mecklenburg and housing and rights to housing and access to housing, and of course, tenant defense. But if you really think about it, access to housing and tenant defense are kind of connected, right? Because for many people, their next stop after being evicted, or under the law called summary ejectment, is homelessness. And so I think there's that aspect of just a disruption of having your housing sort of taken from you and your family is a huge issue. And with inflation growing and inflation both in just the prices of the goods you're consuming, but also in housing prices, what kind of pressures are they doing to increase the amount of evictions and also other things that do disrupt families' lives? And so obviously we've got Ismaail here. And for those of you who aren't super familiar with Ismaail, why don't you just tell the folks here, because this is going to be on YouTube, and I'm sure folks will be watching this, a little bit about just a quick bio of your background and what brought you as both as a community advocate, as a lawyer, into the housing rights space.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, again, thank you to Charlotte Mecklenburg Libraries for having me, and always is Rocky, for allowing me to be here. Yeah, so I think I guess there are really two things. The first is, which I'll get into, is maybe like Rocky mentioned, the sort of broader historical and sort of like sort of policy background that has sort of resulted in the status quo that we have today, with a lot of land being purchased by corporate landlords, skyrocketing rents, and a general sense that Charlotte is no longer affordable, right? In terms of myself, I'm from West Charlotte originally. I'm from Clinton Park, and that's where I live now. And basically, I grew up, and I was always, I think, interested in public interest issues and social justice issues, not just locally, but I think globally. I kind of through like my father, and I had that exposure and that perspective, and I did have a chance to travel and live outside the country. And kind of when I came back in 2014, I experienced we experienced an issue with our own home in Clinton Park, right? And because of various events, we were sort of facing potentially either having to do a loan modification, like a short sale, foreclosure, something along those lines. And I was able basically to kind of help my mother basically get a loan modification, right? And so I was conscious of the financial crisis of 2008, and particularly the effect that had on African American homeowners, and really broadly speaking, just a loss of wealth, of generational wealth, but a loss of wealth for a lot of different people across the entire economy. And basically, I left Charlotte, and I went to law school. I went to law school in New York, City University of New York School of Law, CUNY. And I kind of already had this idea of consumer protection and housing, and I think it was through my relationships that I built there, and through kind of the long-standing kind of history of very radical tenant organizing in New York City, and other forms of organizing, labor organizing. I was at a public interest law school, and those things were available to me both because of the actual programs that were there and the internships that were made available, but also through the relationships. And it was basically through that I became interested in tenant organizing and linking it to a broader kind of analysis of power. And I had my first experience with that in Brooklyn and Evansfield. And, at some point I made the decision for personal reasons and also, I guess, professional and political reasons to come back to Charlotte. And so I came back in 2019. I had applied for several different fellowships, and my interest was basically doing a kind of like an anti-gentrification project that specifically linked different parts of the city and different communities that are impacted by the issue of housing, gentrification, affordability, and also its broader implications of racial and economic justice. So I was going to be working in East Charlotte, and the Latin American Coalition was my host organization. But obviously, like, I'm from West Charlotte and I have that experience. And so really it was about both building bridges and also, organizing around the issue of housing and learning the landscape. And then eventually, I passed the bar and I started my own practice. And my practice, I was very interested in doing tenants' rights work, eviction defense work, and also bringing forth lawsuits against landlords for repair-related issues and things of that nature. In addition to that, I do also breach of contract work for subcontractors that don't get paid, and some wage theft work as well. And I help nonprofit organizations, people interested in forming nonprofits, sort of create their own, organization, get incorporated, get the 501c3 status, and also provide strategic guidance on organizing in that way. So all of it was really linked together, and it was very intentional. But at the same time, things constantly change, and like what I even in the brief period I was away from 2016 to 2019, the explosion of sort of rents increasing, development, corporate ownership of various of land in the city. Even in the short period I was away, I remember every time I would come back and forth, I would come back from New York, there would always be new construction somewhere that I didn't recognize. And so, that's really kind of the thinking behind it, and things have really just kind of taken off since. And, I'm Queen City Community Law Firm, solo practitioner, doing cases and different things like that. So, that's kind of how I came to kind of be into this. And like I said, I'm a Charlotte native, and, this is really important to me. And I want to, I feel like this is the place where I can make the most impact. And I really want to see, see things change for the better.
Okay, so I think in what your discussion there, you did mention your project to sort of link neighborhoods in regards to gentrification. I know that we kind of discussed that in another topic, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the various coalitions that have been kind of brought together since you've returned, that you've been instrumental in helping organize and help facilitating.
Right. So I talked about my fellowship and kind of how that worked. And one of the first things I did actually when I got back was I got involved in the Charlotte Housing Justice Coalition. And the Housing Justice Coalition as an organization for Charlotte really came out of the Keith Lamont Scott protest, or what people call Charlotte Uprising. Is a particular sort of moment of upheaval where people were, rightfully angry and indignant about, the killing of Keith Lamont Scott and police brutality and its broader issues. And of course, we've seen George Floyd, the protest, and there is, I think, a lot of people do have an understanding of, like, at least the visibility of police brutality and sort of its implications. But the Housing Justice Coalition really was intended to address the underlying kind of material conditions that lead to the encounter with the police in the first place. And so what that means is you're talking about the distribution of resources, you're talking about housing and neighborhood segregation, you're talking about where money is invested, has been invested historically, where it hasn't been, and how this basically creates inequality, ghettoization, largely through economic decision-making and policymaking. A lot of policymaking at the federal level, but also many policy decisions at the local level, which prioritize, the interest of some over the interest of others. So the organizers understood that, and they created HJC. And so by the time I came back, I had begun making connections the summer before I actually moved back in 2018, met different organizers, and HJC around the time I came back was involved in the Lake Arbor campaign. And that was, Lake Arbor was a complex in around the Tuckasegee Road area, west side. It was basically like in deplorable condition. The corporate landlords wanted to sell it. and they began to try to intimidate tenants into leaving, and they filed mass evictions against different people, against different tenants in the complex. And basically, there was a campaign to really organize and push back against that, both to educate tenants, to get tenants representation by legal aid and by other attorneys, but also really to really just put public pressure on the city to really intervene, because the Lake Arbor apartment complex was riddled with code violations. And because of that, there are certain powers that the city oftentimes will enact against, say, the owner of a single family home. Maybe the home has serious critical repair needs, and the city may use those powers, right, to either force repairs or to even do the repairs and bill the homeowner. But oftentimes when it comes to these, a larger corporate slumlord, the city is much more reluctant to really utilize that power. So we were pushing on that. And what I did was I actually started a reading group. We began to read a book called In Defense of Housing, which I recommend to everybody if you just want to check it out. And from there, around the reading group and through just various activities, we began to get involved in just different campaigns, working with different organizers across the city. We worked with a particular neighborhood, Howie Acres, to fight against against a developer that wanted to upzone several parcels of land within the neighborhood to build the kinds of McMansions you see in Noda and other areas. The neighborhood was against that because of concerns of gentrification and affordability. And we worked with them and organized with them. And the developer ultimately pulled out. We've kind of been involved in different things. And I guess our most recent thing is that we've released basically a housing resolution, which is a unified platform, which has 31 different points broken into 3 areas. One is tenants' rights, one is community benefits and development, and then one is anti-displacement. And these are basically sort of policy demands, basically policy proposals, demands for the city and the county to use its regulatory power to kind of curtail some of the negative effects of what we're really seeing in terms of gentrification, rising rents, and things of that nature. So it's an ongoing thing, and it's been a long journey. But yeah, getting involved in the Housing Justice Coalition was one thing. And then the other coalition is the Charlotte Community Benefits Coalition, which really, the Housing Justice Coalition is a part of that. And the Community Benefits Coalition really coalesced around the 2040 Comprehensive Plan, and really pushed for the serious inclusion and expansion of community benefits agreements and community benefits within the comprehensive plan. And I can talk a little bit more about that and what that means. But those are 2 of the primary coalitions in which I've been personally directly involved in.
Yeah, so let's go back to Lake Arbor. I feel in some ways it's kind of an emblematic of sort of, because it's pre-COVID, right? But at the same time, it's emblematic of kind of where we're at. So Lake Arbor, it was an apartment complex, correct?
Yes.
But then the landlord decided to just evict everybody. Now, what was the rationale? They were wanting to get everyone out to convert the property, demolish it, and put up something new. What was the rationale behind the mass eviction?
Right. I mean, so if you think about property management, that there's really, if you think about housing, if you break it down to a basic level, housing, obviously there is the human component, there is the need for community, for safety, for being able to raise a family, do all these different types of things. I mean, housing is an essential human need. But then in sort of our kind of capitalistic sort of rendering of our society, housing is hyper commodified, meaning it is a
product.
Right. It is tied not only to maximizing and making profit, but oftentimes the entities or individuals that are profiting from housing are not local. You know what I mean? You have investment companies, you have venture capitalists, you have foreign investors that are heavily kind of invested in corporate real estate. And so basically with Lake Arbor, I mean, that's really what you have. You have an investment company that has basically neglected this property and has extracted rents from people for years and years, and it's been highly profitable and has failed to do repairs and has left people, left tenants living in conditions that are unlivable and uninhabitable as a deliberate part of its business strategy. And then basically when there's an opportunity to flip the complex or sell it, either to another corporation for money, or to maybe do some refitting and finally repair it and then rent it out at market rate. So it's basically just entirely driven by the desire to maximize profit at the expense of the tenants that live there. And that's really we were like kind of trying to kind of intervene at that moment.
Yeah, and I think that kind of plays into, when you mentioned the term gentrification. I know everyone uses that term a lot in Charlotte. You see the news and things of that nature. Even you hear city council people using the term. How would you define that term, and how does it apply to Charlotte?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's definitely one of those terms I think that's been used a lot. So I can tell you what I mean when I say it. So generally, gentrification refers to the process whereby you have a portion of a city or a neighborhood that, for various reasons, has not seen investment, either from the private sector or even necessarily from the government. And as a result, the land is cheap, but oftentimes that particular portion of the city may not have the amenities. There may be not only not have the amenities, but maybe you may have neighborhoods that are suffering from crime, or just a lack of access, right? Like food deserts, things of that nature. And basically, once there's an understanding that the land is profitable and money can be made by purchasing land, demolishing things, redeveloping things, there's basically a flow of capital and investment into the area, not for the benefit of the people who live in the area, but for the benefit of the investors, the ones who basically stand to make money. And what that largely means is, if just logically, if you're going to charge higher, if you're going to demolish something or refit something and charge higher rents, number one, you have to, largely it's going to result in the removal of the population that's already there. And then the second thing is that you're going to have to obviously increase prices and charge higher rents or whatever else, because that's how you're going to maximize profit.
Yeah.
So gentrification is both a local component, a cultural component in terms of the loss of history and identity in an area, but by and large, it's being driven by the desire to maximize profit and capital coming in from all sides into a particular area.
Yeah, and I'm just pulled up on my phone. I decided, what the heck, I'm gonna put in rental increase North Carolina, right? I popped up, and it just says it's a article from, I guess, one of the TV stations out east, but I think it's pretty. It says here, rent across North Carolina increased nearly 20% in the past year. This is from April 2022. According to a report from apartmentlist.com, an average increase of $200 across the state. So you're talking, so in 19, it was probably enough incentive for them to try to get the folks out of Lake Arbor to be able to make the best, quote, highest and best use of that property. That's an old property law term there. But now, with rents increasing, obviously you probably have heard stories from your friends or anyone out there or yourself, that when at the end of your term lease, your landlord went up, I don't know how much, what's the average in Charlotte? If it's 200 is the average in the North Carolina, right? We're 100 counties. There's a lot of poor areas there. Charlotte is probably looking at $400 or $500 average increase, and, given those economic and those other, at the end of the day, if you ask anybody who's like, a property manager or anyone who owns properties, why'd you go up on the rent? I went up because I could, right? Both because I legally could and because the market would allow me, right? And so those are the two. Oh, wait, I think I see someone raising their hand here. I think Preston, why don't you pop in, sir? You can unmute yourself.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning,
Good morning.
Good morning. My statement question is, with rising rents and mortgage, rising rents across Charlotte, can there be legally put caps on rent to stop the rise of rents legally, either by the government or by the private sector? Caps on rent to stop, rent from going up on people. That's my question.
So that's a good question, and I wonder if the state government could, I know that they can control property taxes, with seniors. So why can't they do something along those same lines?
I can take this one.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think, before I answer the question, I mean, I think the question you're asking is a very logical question. And like I said, I went to law school in New York. New York has rent regulation and rent stabilization. That's very much a feature of like the rental and housing market. The state legislature here has made a different policy choice. You know what I mean? They've made a policy choice to quote unquote deregulate the housing market. And a lot of people don't see that as a choice, but that's a very deliberate thing that's been done. So rent stabilization or rent control in any form has actually been explicitly banned at the state level in North Carolina. Right. And this is like the legislature has basically made a choice to for the benefit of corporations, landlords, so on and so forth, at the expense of people in the state. And I think a lot of the work that we've done and that we're doing in terms of Housing Justice Coalition is really trying to point out that this is a choice and really understanding why this choice is being made and really pressing for there to be a different choice. Now, with that being said, is there a way that, say, for instance, in a public-private partnership, whereby the city is providing some kind of public subsidy or tax incentive to a developer that is going to build a housing complex, could the city, as a part of its contract, basically require a developer to either put some kind of like cap on rents, or maybe do like some kind of like affordability, like increase the amount of like affordable housing, depending on how we define it. I mean, our argument that we've made is that, yes, I mean, the city can use its regulatory power, particularly when it's putting public dollars into a project, to really, enact stricter kind of regulations to actually protect renters and affordability. The city attorney might disagree with that, but that's that's something that we really want to press the city to explore as an option. But explicitly, rent control is banned in North Carolina, and again, that is because of a policy choice that has historical implications of who renters have been in North Carolina. Historically, have been poor, working class people, largely as well. Many African Americans were not only renters, but were tenant farmers, for a very long period of time. And so, this choice is not in a vacuum. It's not, I mean, obviously there's corporate greed, but it's also about maintaining a particular long-standing power structure that benefits some over others. And this is very much a feature of the politics. And so we're trying to always link the current decision making with the past and how that's really brought us to where we are, so that we can generate an honest and truthful analysis and develop a strategy for transformation and change.
Yeah, North Carolina's a tough state to do a thing like rent control or something, because it is really a huge issue in the Charlotte Mecklenburg area. It desperately needs something, but because we're not what they call a home rule state, so any kind of local innovation, right? You saw that with the bathroom issue, right? Anytime that there's any kind of sort of progressive or innovation that any locality wants to do, Raleigh can ultimately, snuff it out, because it is constitutionally empowered to do so. Everything has to run through. So you can't just have like a really great idea, take it to the city council and just say, oh, can we just run rent control? We'll just cap, rent increase to 5%, at the end of each term, no more than that in the city of Charlotte. And they would pass that, and then someone would get mad, take it to the legislature, would just wipe it right out, So that's like why that's a tough thing for us. You got a follow-up question?
I do, yes. My next question is, can these politicians put pressure on these landlords any type of way to bring rents down or cap, so to speak, rents? Who in our society can pressure on these landlords who are raising rents constantly on people, making people homeless? Someone has to stop it or control it, at least. Who can? Right.
It's a good question. I mean, I would say that I think two things. Number one, really, this is a question of basically who has power to influence policy and influence legislation and really decision making. And in North Carolina, along with many states across the country, but particularly in a lot of the southern states, the landlord lobby, the apartment association, the developer lobby has for a very long time had a large amount of power and direct access to politicians and to the political system, not only at the state level, but even we're talking about, city council, county commissioners. And so because of that, because landlords have been organized and have put a lot of money into, getting legislation passed that is to their benefit. I mean, that's partially why we're kind of in the position that we're in now. And really, I think the only way for there to actually be any pressure or for there to be really a different policy apparatus that drives wherein, the I guess humanity is sort of prioritized over the profit incentive, it's really going to be for people to organize locally. And really organize locally in different cities across the state and come together and organize at the state level to really push for a different sort of policy response to this particular problem. But to answer the question, I mean, our position, definitely from our research and understanding, is definitely that, there's a lot more that, local politicians could do in terms of the city council. So I'll give a really concrete example. So one of the major problems in Charlotte that you see when it comes to rent are the issues of housing vouchers, right? So you have people that receive not just Section 8 housing vouchers, but housing vouchers under different government programs to basically whereby their rent is being subsidized. The rent that they're paying to a private individual or landlord, corporate landlord is being subsidized by the government. Their landlords are not required to accept housing vouchers in North Carolina. In other states, they are. So the city council actually just recently passed a policy whereby if there is a development and the development more or less receives any kind of public funding or support, meaning it receives some kind of tax incentive or investment from the city, then basically that development and its later iterations must accept housing vouchers from people, right? And so this is basically what's called a source of income discrimination. And the city basically passed an anti-source of income discrimination policy, certainly that's limited to developments that take money or incentives from the city. But still, this is an instance of the city using its regulatory power to protect renters in some way, right? And so if it's possible in terms of source of income discrimination, it's possible it's possible in other ways. But at the end of the day, that's these types of policies that benefit renters and people, ordinary people, are only going to come through again, grassroots community organizing, putting direct pressure on elected officials across the board. And the source of income discrimination campaign, Housing Justice Coalition, supported that. The individual that really pushed for it is, Ryan Carter, and who was at Habitat for Humanity. And so it was really, there was really like a large push across the city for some kind of source of income discrimination policy. But really, it's a lot of the power comes down to elected officials to try to enact stronger regulations that really sort of benefit tenants and even homeowners who maybe are on fixed incomes as well.
Yeah, no, I think that you these are very, there's an interface of law and the political system, and we here in the law can only do what the political system allow us the ability to do. And so maybe this might be a nice way to kind of transition to discussing what are the issues what will the law, what does the politics, what does the law allow us to do vis-a-vis, tenant rights. And so I think this is a great opportunity to ask questions and such, but, and maybe Greg, I think you had some questions, maybe you could maybe ask a couple of things here because again, like maybe it's sort of like in the long-term discussion is, absolutely trying to make some changes in Raleigh to, allow things such as a rent cap, rent control, or my dream is to reverse the whole home rule aspect of the Constitution, but that would, that's what I would like to see, and make places, let local areas be real invaders in democracy, you know, instead of just getting snuffed out every time you do something cool in your backyard. So Greg, why don't you start with some questions, and then maybe we can.
Let me say one thing before. Yeah. So to again, like, I think organizing law and policy are really integrated in. And I just wanted to say, in the Lake Arbor situation, for instance, the tenants in Lake Arbor filed a class action lawsuit against the landlord, right? And they, you know, I think they got like $1 million, but it dragged on for some time. And, you know, I mean, I think that was a win. And the reason that they were able to, the North Carolina Justice Center actually filed the lawsuit on behalf of the tenants at Lake Arbor. And that would not have happened if the tenants had not began to organize, right, and had not began to like advocate for themselves publicly, and, you know, obviously, you know, calling on Action North Carolina and the Housing Justice Coalition. So I just want to say that there is a symbiotic relationship between policy, the law, and community organizing. And the law, I think, when lawyers use their ability in support of movements, I think that's really when you can actually kind of get some real traction and get some things changed. And also, when you organize around an issue like development and housing, you have to have an understanding not only of the actual policy decision making, like the zoning regulations and things of that nature, but you got to understand who the power players are and how things operate, right? And so, like, that's coming down to understanding the different lobbying groups and how to, you know, elicit the support or sort of pressure different elected officials to get involved, and looking at how they vote and what committees they're on. So I just wanted to say that before Greg was questioned.
No, I think that's an incredibly important point. It helps kind of to distill it down to essence of power, right? So when I say power, you know, obviously the ability to do what you want to do, right? And so there are two types of power, really. There is unilateral power, which, you know, is I have a right and I am going to exercise that right. That's a law, right? I have a right to repairs, right? So what Ismaail will talk about is, you know, is a right. It's a unilateral power. But the thing he talked about organizing is something called relational power, right? So, you know, I think relational power is probably best known in sort of the in the ethos of the great campaign in 2008 about yes, we can, right? It's the idea that we organize and we can exert power, right? So, you know, you could have, arguably, and this is one way to look at it, if there was a rent cap law, right, then and the landlord was not following it, then you could sue the landlord based on a unilateral power, basically your right under law. However, and this was pretty popular back in the 60s and 70s and stuff, back when you had actually like poor people, like nationwide organizations where you could organize tenants and just people to picket outside of the landlord's house until said landlord reduced the price. You get the same result, right? You can either use the law and a lawyer to hook it, or you organize enough people and that policy maker, whether it's a private landlord or it's the state, either acquiesces and you know, and does it. I mean, look, notice, like after Charlotte uprising, there reforms started happening after George Floyd. Reforms started happening when people. That's those examples of relational power. And so, you know, if you don't have the unilateral, if Raleigh's captured, then why Ismaail is talking about organizing is that really the people is the power the state can't ever take from you, right? They can't just take your people. You know, you have that, and that is what, you know, you have the ability to kind of exercise. So always keep that in mind. And that's why it's good to join organizations like the Community Benefits Coalition, the Housing Justice Coalition, because through coalition, you grow your ranks and you grow your ability to exert relational power upon those who have power over you. And so just always keep that in mind. But now I think we're ready to jump into the nitty gritty about the landlord tenant. So we're going to put the relational power to the side. We're going right back in the unilateral power, talking about law. And I think this is Greg, if you've got some questions to jump off with I know you've probably been calling questions from just folks that patronize the library and people you know, because I mean, there's tenants everywhere, because in many ways we're either all have been tenants or currently are tenants. So.
Yeah, I was just curious. In North Carolina, is there anything that you can preemptively do if you're signing a lease or a rental agreement for the first time? I mean, is there anything that you can be proactive about to hold your landlord more accountable?
Um, yeah, so honestly, I mean, the best thing you can really kind of do for yourself is to really like know and understand your rights. And the second thing is actually to just read the lease agreement. And that's not an easy task because number one, I mean, a lease is like it's a legal contract. So obviously, you know, trying to read and make sense of the rights and obligations of contracts, it's not like, you know, the most engaging type of reading, and it has like complex language in it. But also a lot of the leases that apartment complexes are using are, it's like this form lease by the apartment association, which is again the lobbying organization for landlords. And the way in which these leases are written and the types of provisions in them are very, very beneficial to the landlord, and very much like I think box the tenant into you know, into a particular place or into a corner. So that also means that a lot of times these leases have many different addendums, like might have like a bed bug addendum, a pet addendum, different types of things that you end up signing. So it's like you know, you can end up having like 100+ page document, right? But I think, you know, oftentimes like everybody is squeezed to find a place to live, and the truth is that as an individual, you don't have a lot of bargaining power when it's you versus like a landlord. You just need a place to live and you sign your lease, and that's the reality. And so the best thing you can kind of do for yourself is, like I said, understand your rights as a tenant, understand your right to a habitable, livable apartment, understand the requirements, what requirements are there in terms of putting your landlord on notice that there may be an issue with the habitability or livability of the apartment complex. Oftentimes leases require notice to be in writing. Sometimes that can mean mailing something. Sometimes that can just mean a text message or an email to a property manager. And then the other thing also in terms of repairs is understanding that you can always call city code enforcement 311. If you find that if you've made a request for repairs, you know, several times for the same issue, and the landlord doesn't do it, you can call code enforcement 311 and they'll come out and they'll inspect the apartment, and they'll basically, if there are any violations, they'll issue violations to the landlord and give them so much time to make repairs, assuming that it's not like what's called an imminently dangerous violation, which those typically have to be repaired between 24 and 48 hours. And the landlord has to have written notice. The good thing about code enforcement is that the code violations that are written are always issued to the landlord, and that's, from a legal standpoint, that serves as written notice. So that's one. I mean, obviously, understanding being a tenant means you obviously, you know, you pay rent and you quote unquote do what's called avoiding waste. And what that means is basically you don't basically make any serious like changes or alterations to the apartment complex without the kind of express written permission of the landlord. You know, another thing to look at too is the fees. You know what I mean? And make sure that, you know, a lot of leases, you know, you may be paying a trash fee or a pet fee or any just other types of fees. But making sure that, you know, like if you're charged a late fee, like for instance, a late fee is capped at $50 or 5%, you know, of the rent that's paid. And oftentimes people are overcharged on late fees, or oftentimes people may just be charged fees that have no basis in the lease. So really the main thing you can do is empower yourself, you know, with knowledge and kind of learn, you know, like learn your rights as a tenant. And I guess we can talk a little bit more about the eviction process from that, but that's really what I would say for an individual. And I would also say, you know, join like, you know, join Housing Justice Coalition, join Action, you know, ask questions to Action and See, go to Legal Aid of North Carolina's website. These are all North Carolina Justice Center. These are all places where you can find resources to educate yourself, and maybe also find some, from at least from organizing HJC, some organizing support, because we do support tenants that are basically trying to organize an association within their apartment complex or union, whatever you want to call it.
All right.
That's good. That actually partially answered the next question I was going to ask, which is if your rights are being infringed upon, who can you reach out to if your landlord is being negligent? And you mentioned 311.
Right. I think so. Yeah, that tends to be the most universal complaint that I've seen is generally related to just repairs and those types of conditions. I have seen some issues, some issues where people have kind of discussed maybe there's some kind of retaliation or harassment or things of that nature that, you know, that may happen. I think if there's an issue like that, it's worth it to either, to reach out to like legal aid or like myself and see if you can at least try to speak to an attorney that could maybe try to give you some advice in that particular situation. Another form of protection that does exist, obviously, is the Fair Housing Act. And the Fair Housing Act is there's both a federal version of that, it's civil rights, law that basically protects from discrimination on the basis of ethnic origin, race, familial status, and particularly disability and things of that nature. And so, for instance, if there's an instance where you made an accommodation request and it's reasonable and the landlord knows that you're disabled for some particular reason, right? Unless there's some sort of circumstance whereby the request can't really reasonably be met, then, if the landlord doesn't do that, that's potentially a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Not to mention overt racial discrimination, not just in the actual landlord-tenant context, but in the context of any kind of housing transaction and purchasing housing and dealing with a real estate broker. Like that's another sort of broad area of protection that's there for different classes of people that experience discrimination. So yeah, I mean, those are, I think, like I said, reaching out to to HJC or, trying to, myself or obviously, Legal Aid of North Carolina, even if they can't represent you, they have really knowledgeable attorneys that are able to provide advice at the very least sometimes and give you a consultation. And yeah, I mean, those are some of the ones that sort of like, come to mind. Obviously, if a landlord, not obviously, but if your landlord, for instance, is moving, wants to evict you, generally they're required to basically provide notice. And what that means is either a notice to vacate letter or a notice to quit letter, typically in writing. If it's oftentimes the lease may have the specific amount of notice time that has to be given. Oftentimes for a 12-month lease, it might be 30 days. And basically the notice has to be given at the end of the rental, after the rental period has expired, right? Provided there hasn't been a breach of the lease agreement. Oftentimes landlords will argue that the tenant breached the lease in some kind of way. And you can get into some of the specific quote unquote breaches of the lease and arguing that point. Yeah, typically there's notice. And so for a month-to-month lease, there's a requirement of a 7-day notice that the landlord has to give in writing if they're asking you to vacate. Mm-hmm. And if they don't provide, and then that notice again has to be, so for instance, say you pay your rent for the month of January, right? And that covers you for that month. The landlord has to wait until the end of January to provide you the notice, and then has to wait 7 days before filing anything, if it's a month-to-month, right? Just as a basic example. And oftentimes landlords don't provide these notices, and that is a basis magistrates will dismiss an eviction of technically what's called a complaint and summary ejectment in North Carolina, but will dismiss the eviction because the landlord didn't provide notice. And a lot of tenants don't realize that when they get the notice, or either if they receive the court papers from the sheriff telling them they have a court date, if they didn't receive the notice, they have a legal defense to their eviction and they can get it dismissed. A lot of tenants don't realize that. Or oftentimes a tenant will receive the notice and believes the notice is actually like a legal summons to court for a proceeding, and it's not, right? Mm-hmm. The notice is just, oftentimes landlords know that tenants will just be intimidated and will move. And in North Carolina, for a residential, I would argue for even a commercial lease agreement, a business lease agreement, but definitely for a residential lease agreement, a landlord must take you to court and get a judgment against you by either a magistrate or a district court judge, depending on whether you appeal it, in order to execute the actual eviction. So a lot of landlords may just try to lock people out, or may try to just intimidate people into leaving. And people, again, if you don't know your rights, you don't realize that basically there's not, you know what I mean? If you've been locked out, you have some kind of legal recourse to reverse that process. The landlord has to actually take you to court to evict you. So understanding all of this is really important when you enter into a lease agreement. So at the very least, if you find yourself in this particular position, you know where to go, you have resources, and you understand your rights, and you can better navigate the situation at the very least.
Yeah, I feel like in Charlotte, there are those who understand their rights are still a little bit reticent to make too much noise, because the housing market is so tight. And if you're in a place, you might be a little reluctant to draw issue to repairs that need to be made, because you don't want to be a squeaky wheel if you've got a place. So I feel like that might come into it also.
Right, and the other, I guess, the other side of that, and part of, I guess, my practice is that, if the conditions of the apartment complex can be shown to be uninhabitable or unlivable, and what's called the Residential Rental Agreement Act, North Carolina General Statute, Section 42-42, the Residential Rental Agreement Act basically kind of governs some very specific standards that basically must be met by a landlord, and the landlord is required to provide a livable space. So it's like not an excuse basically that the tenant accepted it as the condition, the apartment as is, or that the tenant never raised their right to have a livable space. This is implied in every lease agreement. This is called the implied warranty of habitability. And a warranty, as we know, is just a guarantee. Like when you buy a product from a store, it's warranted that the product is going to work the way it's expected to work. The same guarantee exists within a lease agreement, that the landlord is going to provide you with a livable, habitable apartment. It's implied in every agreement, and it can't be, this warranty can't be written off or voided or in any way, shape, or form. So basically, what you find is that the Residential Rental Agreements Act also has very specific conditions that violate, based on oftentimes like local housing codes. So for instance, just off the top of my head, like unsafe flooring, unsafe wiring, heating and air, windows that don't have operable locks. These are like very specific things that are laid out in the Residential Rental Agreements Act. But it's not just limited to that. It's really any sort of condition that is dangerous to health and safety. And if the landlord knew about it before they entered into the agreement with the tenant, then the landlord can basically be found to have been in violation. And the legal remedy for violation is basically what's called a rent abatement. And what that means is basically a tenant, if they've paid rent, if the landlord has normally collected rent from the tenant and the tenant has paid rent, the tenant can basically seek to recover that back in a legal action. And not only the rent itself, but basically if a landlord is found to have known that the premises were not livable and not habitable, and they continually charge the tenant rent anyway, it is, there's case law that basically states that is what's called an unfair and deceptive trade practice. Basically akin to a misrepresentation, I would say fraud. And basically that if that's the case, then not only can the tenant demand the rent back, but they can try to seek to get triple damages, meaning 3 times back what they paid. And not just their rent, but any other out-of-pocket expenses for instance, if someone paid a repair bill themselves, or if someone had to move to a hotel because they couldn't live in the apartment and they were still paying rent. So those are the types of cases that I often bring. And I don't, a lot of times, if a landlord files for an eviction, then say, for instance, legal aid or other attorneys may countersue under what I'm talking about, a violation of the implied warranty of habitability. But you don't have to wait for an eviction to be filed. Like a tenant can affirmatively, meaning can basically just bring a lawsuit against their landlord without having to wait. And I do those cases too. And in addition to that, there are other issues like mold and things like that are those cases are very expensive to litigate, and they get into the need for like a medical expert. But the tenants basically do have some legal remedies in addition to obviously a simple breach of contract claim as well. So there are some legal tools out there in cases that can also be used. And a lot of times, of course, I mean, recovering money is important, but oftentimes like I said, it's about power. So even in an individual situation, if a tenant it brings an action against a landlord or it countersues, it gives the tenant leverage, right? Oftentimes to be able to negotiate, like a better position, right? Whether that's getting extra time to move, whether that's, basically like allowing the tenant being allowed to stay for the duration of their lease agreement. So oftentimes my job as an attorney is really just to give the tenant some leverage in the situation in order to be able to get a better outcome. But then there are other cases where it's just very much, going after someone that has basically neglected their obligations on behalf of my client as well. So that's more of the sort of direct attorney side. I know I've said a lot of things, so I'll stop and let folks ask questions.
Mr. Gibson, unmute yourself. There you are.
I have a question. And my language may be kind of coarse. Why are there so many slum landlords across America? A coarse term, but
Right. No, it's
that's what I can describe it.
Well, it's a great question. And I mean, I'd be curious to hear kind of what other folks think, but I mean, I just think it just comes down to money. I mean, it's a great business model. I mean, if you think about it, you own, a house or units, whatever, and the people pay you rent, and then you don't put any money into repairs. You know what I mean? And you charge the people fees, and you can, you can just kind of enrich yourself, and you don't really have to do very much. And as well, because the government is not really enforcing regulations or really enforcing the rights of tenants, the landlords have a very strong lobbying group across the entire country. You can kind of do it and get away with it. And people need a place to stay. People are desperate. People may not know their rights. Particularly, you're talking about really vulnerable populations, such as like the undocumented population. Particularly in Charlotte, there are a lot of I would call slum kind of apartments that large numbers of undocumented people live in. And it's not only just that they may live there, but you might have somebody who's maybe not even on the lease legally, but just needs a place to stay. So you have all these very sort of housing is a human need, and basically a person is enriching themselves, profiting from the fact that people need housing, and there's very little regulation to really stop it or to protect the people who are being exploited, and it's highly profitable. I mean, it's to me, I compare it to any kind of exploitative industry. Even something, I mean, people might find the comparison extreme, but even something like slavery, right? I mean, it's that's what it is. It's at its core, it's the extraction of wealth, and the use of property rights to extract wealth. And our legal system historically and always values property rights over human rights. You know what I mean? We have to remember that, those of us who are African descent were brought here as property. And so there's and the land taken from the Native Americans was, for the express purpose of individual property rights and cultivating land and making the land profitable or, valuable, whatever else in that way. So this cuts to the very core of what America is and what America has done. And, just have to be honest about that when we talk about this issue.
Oh, no, I mean, that's very poignant. I think, that the housing, it is a human need, whether it's a human right. I think that obviously is a political question, but it's absolutely a human need. I think they're, and I think that's where, we are at a crossroads. I think in our society is when do needs become rights and when can we acknowledge them? And probably one of the stumbling blocks is the profit motive, right? There's a certain level, can we, it's kind of like Mahatma Gandhi once said, we have enough for our need, we just don't have enough for our greed, and I think there's that kind of aspect there. But what we can do in the meantime, because again, this is a long struggle, everything has been a struggle for any kind of real right, and it continues. It's not like it's kind of like those movies, the horror movies, you think it's done? No, Jason's back, and it'll be like Friday the 13th, 87 or something like that, right? I mean, this is an ongoing, kind of struggle. But what hopefully the point of our discussion today is just is to get those of you, particularly those of you who are tenants or no tenants, that you do have rights. I mean, I think that what Ismaail has kind of laid out is that you don't just have to take it. I know that it's scarce. Housing is scarce. And, I know that when you operate out of fear, you make bad choices, number one. And I think that fear of displacement, that's a bad fear. Fear of not having anywhere else to go if you are displaced and such. But I think, number one, landlords do have responsibilities to, what did we say, like implied warranty of habitability, right? That even if it's not in the contract, right? You just maybe just like somebody wrote you something on a napkin and said, I'll rent it for you for this. The law still says that it has to be habitable for humans, not habitable for a dog or not habitable for a gerbil. I'm talking about a human being. And if you don't have running water, and if if your thermostat isn't working, I mean, again, we're not talking about dog houses, we're talking about human houses, right? And so if those aren't working correctly and you are paying rent, then yeah, I think Ismail's correct, is that number one, they're violating it, and it is arguably an unfair deceptive trade practice, because you're basically frauding someone, saying you're paying me for a habitable place, but it's not habitable. So, and so there are things that you can do. Now, I do want to stress that the law and the policymaker didn't make it easy for tenants to be able to exercise your rights. So while you do have rights, the getting from point A to B to exercise your rights are a little more, and that I think is, I think that's the toughest part. So if you ever get, any kind of notice, or you do have issues with your housing, reach out to someone like Ismaail, or like you said, legal aid, again, of North Carolina. There are other places, North Carolina Justice Center, Action NC, as you mentioned, that can help and connect you, because, I will say that, it would be great if everyone could DIY their entire tenant defense and everything. But, this is highly technical types of paperwork that's involved, and highly technical types of arguments that have to be made in court. So spread the word to your folks out there that, there's the Achilles heel of any landlord is a tenant's attorney. I mean, that's just as simple as that. And so if you if they get a landlord to evict you, I mean, they get an attorney to evict you, which they probably do, you should need an attorney to defend you. I know there's costs and other things, but there are things, there's ways to work that out. I think that your housing is extremely important to you and your family. This is, there's a lot of things to kind of choose between and among, but I think doing what you can to protect your housing until the day that housing is a human right codified in our law. Do what you can to protect your family and yourself in your housing, and one stop is consulting with an attorney like Ismaail or legal aid in North Carolina before it gets worse. Oh man, do we got any other questions? I think we're over time here. Sorry, I went on a little soliloquy there. but this is going up on YouTube. And again, do we have any kind of, you can look up Ismaail. It's a Queen City community law firm. There's also legal aid in North Carolina. Obviously, you can reach out to your local librarians. They definitely know this town like the back of their hands. I mean, they know every, they're unofficial social workers of Mecklenburg, Charlotte Mecklenburg, or your librarians, so they are there for you too. So anyway, again, thank you for coming and joining us to this discussion with Fridays Rocky, and we'll be back, I assume, next month, right, Greg? Or the month after? When are we?
Should be. Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, everyone, enjoy your weekend. And again, Ismaail, thank you for joining us and sharing your wisdom and experience. And do we have a question from Preston, or are you just waving goodbye?
I'm saying goodbye.
Oh, thank you, sir, for your attendance, and please join us again.
They were good questions.
Okay.
Yeah, this was fantastic. I actually have some ideas to follow up with this discussion. So,
All right.
yeah, so new programs coming up to be announced soon.
Awesome. All
right. Thanks.
All right, everybody. Take care.
Thank you guys for having me.
Bye. Thank you.